Today I'm going to give you a primer on the history of Iran, which is also called Persia. I'm going to start at the beginning with ancient Persia, and I'm going to go all the way to the present. So if you don't know anything about the history of Iran, or if you know some bits and pieces, but you want to see how it all fits together, then this video is for you. So first of all, before we get into the individual dynasties, it's helpful to get a sense of the timeline, to get oriented on the timeline. And so an easy way to do that is to do what historians call periodization, where you take the timeline, you chop it up into chunks. And this periodization, the act of periodization, is always very arbitrary. Where we decide to draw a boundary between two periods is arbitrary, but it's helpful. It can help us to get a handle on thousands of years of history. So for Iran, you can think of Iranian history as being divided into three big segments, or two really long segments and then one short segment that we're still in. First of all, there's ancient Persia, and that includes the Elamites, the Persian Empire that we're familiar with as having fought the Greeks, and then some other later dynasties, Alexander the Great, and so on. And then that ends with the Arab conquest. The Arabs conquered Iran in the 600s AD. Or during the 630s and 640s was the period of the Arab conquest of Iran. Then that begins the second long phase, or long epoch of Iranian history. So you have ancient Persia, and then there's what you might call medieval Persia, or you might refer to it as Islamic Persia, because it's a period of Islamic rule in Persia, and also a period when Islamic norms prevailed. In contrast to the third phase, which began more or less in the 1800s, which is the phase of heavy Western influence. The people of Iran are still Muslim today, even though they have all this Western influence, but there's been enormous cultural and political influence from the West on Iran in spite of that. So we have these three big segments. You have ancient Persia, then you have Islamic Persia, and then you have, at the end, the shorter segment of Western influence. And then each of these really long periods can be divided up into sub-periods. And typically, when people talk about Iranian history, they talk about dynasties. But there have been lots of dynasties in Iranian history. So the first level of comprehension is to know these three big phases. Then once you know these three big phases, then you can go into more depth and you can look at individual dynasties. And then within dynasties, you can look at individual centuries, individual rulers, individual decades and years, and get more fine-grained. The earliest urban culture with cities and complex urban life was Elam, which was located in what is now southwestern Iran, bordering on the Mesopotamia region. Actually, it was part of Mesopotamia. The region of Elam included the low-lying area of part of Mesopotamia, a flat area in what is now Khuzestan province, which was basically an extension of the Mesopotamian plain. And then it also extended up into the mountains to the east. The Elamite civilization lasted for a really long time, and it's considered part of the ancient Near East. It was one of the ancient Near Eastern civilizations, along with the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Assyrians. But that was in the time frame of 2000 BC, 1000 BC kind of area. But the ancient Persian civilization that gets the most attention, that's the most famous, is the Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire is also known as the Achaemenid dynasty, and it's named after an ancestor of the dynasty named Achaemenids in Greek. The Greek name for him is Achaemenids. And a lot of the names for ancient Persian figures, ancient Persian people, ancient Persian cities, these are Greek forms of those names. Now, the term Persian comes from the region of Fars, or Parsa, which was the location where that dynasty originated. So the founder was Cyrus. Cyrus conquered a very large area. He conquered Mesopotamia and Asia Minor, and he went and conquering in the east in what is now Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkmenistan. And then when he died, his son went on to conquer Egypt. And then Darius came to the throne. He came to the throne in kind of suspicious circumstances, and it's not entirely clear exactly what his connection was with Cyrus in terms of like their family connection or whatever. And I'm not going to go into the details in this video, but basically Darius is in some ways the second founder of the Achaemenid dynasty. Basically, all the later Achaemenid rulers were descendants of Darius. And the Achaemenid dynasty is most famous for attempting to invade Greece. And that's not because it was the most important thing that happened to the Persian Empire or the Achaemenid Empire. It's because what we know about the Persians comes from Greek historians who wrote about what they cared about, which was the Greek relationship with Persia. And there's always been a bias among Westerners, among Europeans, to look at the histories of non-European countries from a European perspective. And so we have tended, as people of the West, to emphasize Western aspects of Persian history, or the ways in which Persia interacted with the West. But from the Persian perspective, the Greek wars were not super important. But basically what happened with the Greek wars was Persia attempted to invade Greece twice, in 490 and 480 BC, and failed both times. The Persian Empire lasted until 330-ish BC, depending on where you want to draw the line, but about 330. And it was brought to an end by Alexander the Great, who was from Macedon to the north of Greece. His father had conquered the Greek city-states, and then he died, and then Alexander took over, and Alexander led the Greek armies on a campaign of conquest across the Persian Empire, and they conquered the entirety of the Persian Empire. And then Alexander had intended to reign as an emperor over all these areas, and basically he was trying to establish his dynasty on the Persian throne to replace the Achaemenid dynasty. But he died, and his successor was very young, and his generals fought over the throne. And instead of one of the generals winning and taking over the empire, they ended up splitting the empire amongst them. So there was one general who took over Egypt, there was one general who took over Greece, there was another general in Asia Minor, there were actually multiple generals in the Greek area. And there was also a general that took over Syria, Mesopotamia, and Persia, and that was Seleucus. So Seleucus founded a new dynasty called the Seleucid dynasty, which was the next dynasty to rule over Persia. The Seleucid dynasty ruled, the dates are kind of fuzzy depending on where you draw the boundaries, but basically it ruled from about 300-ish BC until the 100s BC. Now, the Seleucids were part of a phenomenon called the Hellenistic era, when there was a lot of Greek cultural influence in the Middle East. And during this time, there was a lot of mixing between Greek culture and Persian culture within Persia. The most famous thing about the Seleucid Empire is this is the origin of Hanukkah, the Jewish holiday Hanukkah, because there was a later Seleucid emperor, ruler named Antiochus IV, who persecuted the Jews, and he confiscated the temple in Jerusalem and turned it over to pagan worship. And there was a rebellion among the Jewish people, the Maccabean Revolt. They drove out the Seleucids and established an independent kingdom called the Hasmonean Kingdom. And the holiday of Hanukkah commemorates the restoration of the temple at the end of that revolt. The Seleucid dynasty slowly declined in power, and there had been another power that had come in from the east called the Parthians or the Arsacids. And so we have, again, this thing where we have two names for the dynasty. One refers to the dynastic name, the ancestral name of the ruling house. The other refers to the geographical term. So Parthia was a geographical area where they came from. Arsacids was the founder, or at least that's the Greek name for the founder of the dynasty. And so the Arsacids, or aka the Parthians, ruled over Iran more or less from about 200, 150 BC up until 224 AD, or roughly that. I mean, that's the conventional date, is 224. So they ruled for over 400 years, about 450 years total, which is one of the longest reigning, if not the longest reigning dynasty in Persian history. I think it's the longest reigning, that's the longest reigning dynasty in Persian history. But it's also the dynasty we know the least about, because we have almost no written records from that period, and the Greeks and Romans were writing very little about them, and most of what we know about them actually is their interactions with the ancient Romans. And a lot of what we know actually comes from coins. So in many cases, we only know the name of the ruler because it's printed on the coin, but we don't know anything else about the ruler besides that in some cases. Okay, so that's the Parthians, or the Arsacids, and they were brought to an end by another dynasty that again came out of Parsa, like the old Achaemenids did, and this was the Sasanians, or the Sasanids. Ardashir I defeated the last Parthian ruler in battle and overthrew the Parthian dynasty and took power and established the Sasanian dynasty. The Sasanian dynasty lasted for about 4 centuries, from the early 200s to the early 600s. It's during the Sasanian period that the Zoroastrian religion reached more or less its present form, and its scriptures were codified. A couple other major religions were born in Sasanian Persia, most notably Manichaeism. Manichaeism was a world religion that was widely distributed in Asia and Europe and North Africa during the Middle Ages, but it has since gone extinct. It's perhaps the only example of a world religion going extinct. But that began in the 200s under Sasanian rule. Another famous thing about the Sasanian dynasty was that they fought a number of wars against the Romans. And then the Romans, the Eastern Roman Empire, continued on after the Western Roman Empire fell. The Eastern Roman Empire continued on through the Middle Ages, and modern-day historians refer to it as the Byzantine Empire. So the Eastern Romans, or the Byzantines, fought a bunch of wars against the Sasanians. Sometimes the Sasanians would win, sometimes the Eastern Romans would win. The last war that they fought was also the biggest, the largest scale, that lasted for many years and went back and forth, during which the Sasanians sacked Jerusalem and took away the Christian relics that were there. This is in the early 600s, when Jerusalem was a Christian city because the Roman Empire had converted to Christianity. But then the Romans counterattacked and landed troops behind enemy lines, marched down to Ctesiphon, which was the main capital of the Sasanian Empire, which was located in modern-day Iraq, and burned it and destroyed it, ending the war. And the war more or less ended as a draw. That giant war between the Byzantines, aka the Romans, and the Sasanians happened right before the coming of Islam. So the Arab conquest happened in the middle part of the 600s, or the 7th century. And the Arabs invaded both the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire simultaneously. They conquered a really large portion of the Roman Empire, but not all of it. So there was still a small portion of the Eastern Roman Empire remaining in Asia Minor, Greece area, for the most part, and a little bit of southern Italy. But at the same time, the Arabs conquered all of the Persian Empire. The Sasanian dynasty came to an end, and all of Persia came under Arab Muslim rule. There were a couple of early Islamic dynasties that ruled over Persia from outside of Persia, and they were not Persian dynasties, they were Arab dynasties. The first was the Umayyad dynasty, which came to power in the year 661 and continued until 750. The Umayyad dynasty was an Arab dynasty, and they were ruling over the Persians as a subjugated people. The Persian people had to pay taxes to their Muslim overlords. Now, contrary to a popular myth, the Muslims did not force their religion on the people that they conquered. The people of the Middle East did end up converting to Islam, but not right away. And there was a period of time in which the Muslims were a small minority among the people of the Middle East, although they were a ruling elite. They were a ruling minority. The Persians had been predominantly Zoroastrian, with some Jewish and Christian minorities and some Manichaean minorities and some other religious groups. And those people slowly converted to Islam over a period of time. So they were conquered by the Muslims in the 600s, and by the 900s, the vast majority of the population of Iran had converted to Islam. But there was a period of a number of generations during which that process happened. And so as the Persian people converted to Islam, Islam became integrated into Persian culture. And this represents a big shift in Persian culture. A lot of new things were brought to Persia as a result of the Islamic religion, obviously, and also the Arabic language. The Arabic language had enormous impact on the Persian language. A lot of loan words came into Persian. The Persian language started to be written in the Arabic script. Some people think that Persian and Arabic must be really similar to each other, but that's not true. They're actually very different languages. Persian's very different grammatically, but it does have a ton of loanwords from Arabic. So the first dynasty was the Umayyads, and then they were overthrown in 750 by the Abbasids, and the Abbasids were the second big dynasty of early Islam. Now, during the Abbasid period, a lot of Persian culture started to seep into the rest of the Islamic world. For example, in the case of the Abbasid dynasty itself, the dynasty took on a different character, whereas the early Arabs, the early Muslim Arabs, and the Umayyads had a more egalitarian attitude toward being Arab, like all Arabs are equal to each other. That began to change with the Abbasids, where the Abbasid rulers adopted a more Persian style of kingship, where the ruler is set apart from the common people, and he sits apart in this, a palace that no one else can go to and access, and he sits in a throne room, and he's surrounded by courtiers, and there's a highly ritualized court culture. The Abbasids founded a new capital city of Baghdad in Iraq, and the Baghdad was designed originally along Persian lines, because there were a lot of ancient Persian cities that had been built in a circular fashion, and Baghdad was originally built in a circular shape. Now that original circular shape has been obscured over the centuries with repeated building and rebuilding and putting streets in new places, and so the original plan is gone now. A lot of popular literature came into the rest of the Islamic world from Persia. And in fact, a lot of that Persian literature had originated in India and had been translated from Indian languages into Middle Persian. And then they were translated from Middle Persian, which was the language of the Sasanian dynasty, translated from that into Arabic, where it became widely disseminated in the Islamic world. There are a lot of things that we as Westerners attribute to the Arabs or attribute to the Muslims, like mathematical knowledge, like the number 0, using digits to represent numbers rather than Roman numerals. Well, they had gotten it from the Persians, from the pre-Muslim Persians, who had gotten it in many cases from the Indians. So there was a whole chain of transmission going from India through Persia, through the Arabs to Europe over the centuries. Now, the Abbasid dynasty did not so much end as it sort of faded away. And that's actually a complicated subject unto itself. But for my purposes here, what I mean by that is Abbasid power slowly decreased. They lost control of the outer provinces, and then eventually they lost control of the inner provinces. And during the 900s through the 1100s, the Abbasid dynasty was just a ceremonial dynasty that lived in Baghdad and had no political power. Now, in these outlying areas, new dynasties arose. And in the Persian world, there was a whole succession of new dynasties, the Tahirids, the Safavids, the Samanids. I'm not going to talk about them in any detail. Just in general, they represented a kind of Persian cultural revival. One dynasty I'll mention is called the Ghaznavids, and they were actually of Turkic origin. Now, two notable things about the Ghaznavids. First, they waged wars of conquest in northern India and ended up bringing Islamic rule into India. And secondly, that was the dynasty in power when Ferdowsi wrote the Shahnameh. The Shahnameh is the most famous work in Persian literature. It's an epic poem that tells the history of the ancient Persian rulers. Okay, so I mentioned the Turks, and this becomes a really important element in Persian history from here on, because more and more Turks filtered into Persia from Central Asia over the centuries. First, they were brought in as slaves, but then also other Turks started migrating in from Central Asia into the Middle East and into Persia, and they started ruling different parts of the Persian world. The Ghaznavids represent an early example of this, but there were also other dynasties. One of the most famous Turkic dynasties to rule in Persia was the Seljuks, who came to power in the 1000s. Now, the Seljuks are most famous for doing something called the Sunni revival. Now, back during the 900s, a collection of dynasties had come to power in different parts of the Middle East that were all Shiite. There were the Fatimids in Egypt, the Buyids or Buwayhids in Persia. I think there was another one, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. And they came to power as Shiite dynasties ruling over a Sunni majority. Then the Seljuks came in and overthrew the Buyids and reestablished Sunni rule in much of the Middle East, and then promoted Sunni Islam through endowing mosques and madrasas. Madrasas were a new thing that were emerging in the Islamic world. They were basically schools where men could go and study Islamic law and become Islamic scholars. And they studied Sunni, the Sunni version of Islam. During this time, Iran was predominantly Muslim because the process of conversion had largely run its course, but they were mostly Sunni Muslims. Shiites represented only a small minority of the Persian population so far. Okay, so let's recap. So we have ancient Persia, which if you start with the Persian dynasty of the Achaemenids and go up to the end of the Sasanians, that's about 12 centuries. And then you have the Islamic period, or the medieval period, that goes from the 600s to the 1800s. That's again 12 centuries. And then there's the Western stuff, Western influence at the end, the last couple centuries. Now, this Islamic stuff, this 12 centuries from the rise of Islam to the rise of the West, that can be divided up into two parts. So you have the first 600 years and then the second 600 years. The first 600 years is before the Mongols. Then the next 600 years is after the Mongols. The Mongols are a huge event in Iranian history. And you could even divide the whole timeline up into 4 segments. You could have the ancient period, then you could have the period of early Islamic rule, then you could have the period of post-Mongol rule. You might refer to it as the Turco-Mongolian period, and then the Western stuff at the end. That would be another way of divvying up the timeline, because the Mongols really were that big of a deal in Iranian history. So the Mongol Empire was founded in Mongolia, obviously, by a guy named Chinggis Khan, or he's sometimes referred to in English as Genghis Khan. And Chinggis Khan went on these wars of conquest where he invaded northern China, he invaded Central Asia. After he died in 1227, his successors, the members of his family, his sons and grandsons, carried on the conquests. The Mongols invaded Iran and took it over, and they took it over for good. They actually invaded several times, but they took it over for good in the 1250s, and then they reigned over Persia, over the Persian people. And this was quite a shock to the Persians because the Persians were Muslim. The Mongols at first were not Muslim. The Mongols were pagans. They were polytheists. But they came into Persia and ruled over it for a while, and then eventually converted to Islam and became legitimate Muslim rulers. But what's really significant about the period of Mongol rule in Persia was that Persia was now integrated into this huge empire. It's often referred to as the largest land empire ever to have existed in history. And it spanned from the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia and Korea and China, all the way across the Asian continent, across Central Asia, to the Middle East, and to Russia. So now Iran was a small part of this much larger empire, and it was integrated into this huge multicultural empire. There were Persian craftsmen who were taken off to China by the Mongols to work in Mongol workshops. Chinese artistic styles filtered into Persia and influenced Persian art. If you look at Persian art from the 1300s and on, you'll see a lot of Chinese influence there that comes from the Mongol period. Now, the Mongol Empire lasted in a united form from the time of Chinggis Khan in the early 1200s, 1206, up until 1260. And in 1260, it broke apart into 4 big pieces. I mean, these are 4 really big pieces, larger than most empires had ever been. And the piece that controlled Iran was called the Ilkhanate. So the Ilkhanate was a Mongol regime that ruled over Iran in the late 1200s, early 1300s. And it was during the period of the Ilkhanate that the Mongol rulers converted to Islam and eventually integrated into Persian culture and assimilated and became part of the Persian population. The regime of the Ilkhanate collapsed, and there were several other regimes that happened during the 1300s, 1400s. I'm not going to go into all of them because it gets a little bit complicated. I'll just note one regime from that period, and that's the Timurids. So there was a guy named Timur, or Tamerlane, who lived in the late 1300s. And he took his army and he went around conquering neighboring areas, trying to recreate the old Mongol Empire. But his idea was to recreate the Mongol Empire by recreating all of the destruction and chaos and sorrow that the Mongol Empire had brought to the people. Back when the Mongol Empire had happened in the 1200s, it brought enormous destruction. But then after the wave of destruction and conquest, they ruled as an empire and actually tried to rule their people. Timur didn't do that. Timur was just thinking about the conquest and fighting and pillaging part of it. So he would go around pillaging and pillaging and pillaging, and he would never try to consolidate control over an area. He would just go back and pillage some more. And he was constantly pillaging and going and destroying cities, taking craftsmen, taking them back to Samarkand in Central Asia to build up his capital city. And he caused enormous destruction across the region, across Iran. Now, after he died, his sons and grandsons took over different pieces of the empire he had created, and they are known collectively as the Timurids. And so there was this Timurid period of Iranian history basically in the 1400s, particularly in the eastern part of Iran. Skipping over the other dynasties for the sake of brevity, in the 1500s, a new dynasty came along called the Safavids. And this is when Iran became Shiite. This is the most important thing about the Safavid dynasty, was that the Safavid dynasty brought Shiism. Well, actually, there had already been Shiism in Iran, but most Iranians were not Shiite. But when the Safavid dynasty took over in the 1500s, it presided over a conversion of the population to Shiism. And it's not really clear exactly how that process played out. Usually, I think if you read a history book about it, usually it'll just say that it forced people to be Shiite, but we don't really know the details about how that worked. And the particular branch of Shiism that the Safavids adhered to was Twelver Shiism, or Imami Shiism, and that's the branch of Shiism that predominates in Iran today. There are other branches of Shiism, but they're found more like in India, Pakistan, some parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, aside from making Iran Shiite, there are a couple other things about the Safavids that are kind of famous. One is, there was one ruler in particular named Abbas the Great, and he founded a new capital city at Esfahan. Now, Esfahan had already existed. It predated Islam, actually. But what Abbas the Great did was he created a new planned city on the outskirts of the old city of Esfahan, and it had these broad avenues and this enormous rectangular plaza and these huge monumental buildings. And this Maidan, as it's known in Persian, this Maidan is like a big plaza. This Maidan is very famous. It's the most famous part of Esfahan today. And so Esfahan in the 1600s was the capital of Iran. And there were palaces, and this enormous royal mosque was built there, which still stands, but it's no longer called the Royal Mosque. And it's also famous, both Esfahan and Safavid dynasty in general, is famous because it's during the Safavid period that Western visitors started coming in regular numbers. Now, there had been Europeans visiting Iran in previous centuries. There had been Europeans who had visited Iran during the time of the Mongols. There were during the time of the Timurids. But now, during the Safavid period, this was starting to become more and more common, especially in the 1600s, in the latter part of the Safavid dynasty. And when they would come, they often came to Esfahan, the capital city. And so we have several descriptions of the capital city from European travelers, as well as descriptions of other parts of the empire and descriptions of the culture of Persia at the time and how they dressed and what kinds of food they ate. So this is the other kind of famous thing about the Safavids, is that Iran is starting to get into more regular contact with the West. And this was the beginning of a trend that was going to increase enormously in later centuries. So the Safavid dynasty is 1600s up through the early 1700s. In 1722, the dynasty basically came to an end, or at least Safavid political power came to an end in 1722. The next big political power, which is during the 1700s, was a man named Nader Shah, who is sometimes referred to as the Napoleon of Persia, which is not a great analogy, but for our purposes, as a quick primer of Iranian history, let's just go with that. He's the Napoleon of Persia. And he took his armies and waged campaigns of conquest across the whole region, and he created this empire that was rather short-lived. I guess in that respect, he's similar to Napoleon. When he died, his empire collapsed. And there were some other regimes that ruled in different parts of Iran during the 1700s. I'm going to skip over them for the purposes of this video. And at the very end of the 1700s, a new dynasty came along called the Qajars. And the Qajars are kind of the ending of a lot of things in Persian history. So they're the last Turco-Mongolian dynasty, going back to the Ghaznavids and the Seljuks and the Ilkhanate back in the 1000s, 1100s, 1200s. all the way through 1300s, all the way up to the early 1900s, Iran was ruled by a long series of Turkic dynasties that had their roots one way or another in the nomadic pastoralism of traditional Turkic life. The Qajar dynasty is a pivotal period in Persian history because this is when Western influence became really dominant in Iranian society. And it was during the 1800s that happened, not in any previous century. What changed in the 1800s? Industrialization happened. That's the big thing. That's the thing that made it possible for Europeans to be so much more powerful than other parts of the world. It was industrialization that made it possible for the Europeans to establish their colonial empires overseas. So Europe in the 1800s went through this process of industrialization where they were able to harness the energy in coal to power new and more powerful machines. They could mass produce things on a larger scale than was possible before. And because of their new abilities to mass produce, their new energy sources, that gave them an edge. They were able to produce more powerful weapons and more weapons, a larger number of weapons. They could also dominate the rest of the world economically because they could produce things at a huge, vastly accelerated rate than other parts of the world because of their mass production factories. So during the 1800s, European power came to Iran in two forms. There was the economic form and the strategic military form. So in the form of economic dominance, the Europeans were interested in the raw materials that were available in Iran. And there were a number of raw materials that they were going in to extract wealth from, but the most notable was oil, which was discovered in southwestern Iran in the early 20th century. And the British came and established a company to extract oil from southwestern Iran, and they arranged a contract with the Qajar dynasty where they would keep most of the profits from the oil. And this would become significant later on in the 20th century. And then another motivation the Europeans had for going into Iran was military strategy between European powers, specifically between the British and the Russians, who in the 1800s were competitors. The British were in the process of colonizing India. I mean, they had already colonized much of India, but they were in the process of consolidating their control in India. And at the same time, Russia was expanding eastward and southeastward through Asia. So the British were in India, and the Russians were in Central Asia, and as the British moved northward, the Russians moved southward, and they clashed in the neighborhood of modern-day Afghanistan, Iran. And this rivalry between Britain and Russia spilled over into Iran itself. So there were portions of Iran that were conquered and taken over by these imperial powers. Russia took over areas of what had been northern parts of the Persian Empire. And the British took over areas that had been the eastern parts of Persia. And then they established zones of influence within Persia itself, the British in the south and the Russians in the north. Okay, so this brings us to the 20th century, and I'm not going to go into any detail of the 20th century. I'm going to talk about the real basic stuff. So first of all, in the very early part of the 20th century, during the latter stages of the Qajar dynasty, there was a movement to make Persia a constitutional monarchy in emulation of the constitutional monarchies of Europe. And a new constitution was adopted in 1906 that became more or less the constitution of the country up through the 1970s, although it wasn't always implemented. The idea of a written constitution, this is significant because this is a European idea, the idea that you should have a written constitution. The idea that you should have elections where the population elects representatives and their representatives pass laws. This is a European idea. So this is an example of how European culture was influencing Iran's political life. The Qajar dynasty came to an end in 1925, and a new dynasty began in that year. Reza Khan took power as the new king, and he is known as Reza Shah. Shah is the Persian word for king. And he began a new dynasty in Iranian history called the Pahlavi dynasty. And the Pahlavi dynasty only existed during part of the 20th century. It only had two monarchs, and that was Reza Shah and his son Mohammad Reza Shah. Reza Shah was king of Iran from 1925 until 1941. In 1941, he was deposed by the British and the Soviets working together. What had happened was World War II was going on, and the British wanted to open supply routes to the Soviets to help the Soviets defeat Germany. So the British and the Soviets cooperated in invading Iran and occupying it during the war. And they deposed Reza Shah and put his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, on the throne instead. So Mohammad Reza Shah ruled basically during the middle part of the 20th century, during the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And during that time, I'm glossing over details, but basically he was a dictatorial ruler who oppressed his people. Gross oversimplification, but this entire video is a gross oversimplification of Iranian history. It can't be helped. I'm trying to go very quickly. It's a primer. If you want any details or any further information about any of these things, you could put a comment down below and recommend I make a video about that, or you can go read about it. The purpose of this video is just to give you a quick overview, so I realize I'm being very simplistic in my coverage of the 20th century. But anyway, Mohammad Reza Shah ruled until the 1970s, and there were a lot of people in Iran who weren't happy with his rule, and there was a movement to overthrow him, and there was a revolution that happened during 1978-79 that deposed him, and he left the country. And that's known as the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The regime that came to power as a result of the Iranian Revolution was the Islamic Republic. So instead of having a monarchy, or what was in theory a constitutional monarchy, they were replacing that with a republic. And again, here's where Western influence is so consequential in Iran. The idea of a republic. That's a Western idea. The idea that sovereignty rests with the people, and that the people create their government. Now, it's a little bit different with the Islamic Republic, but the basic idea of having a republic where the people govern themselves through representatives, that's a Western concept. As an Islamic Republic, it's a little bit different from a regular republic. So, you have something like the French Republic or the Italian Republic, everyone, or the United States for that matter, sovereignty rests with the people. The people are the final arbiters of law and of what is right. It's a little bit different in Iran because it's supposed to be a republic where the people govern themselves, but within the constraints of Islamic teaching. And so the way the government of the Islamic Republic is set up, there is a democratic process, there are elections, there is an elected body that represents the people and passes laws, but then at the same time there are other branches of government consisting of religious clergy who oversee what the elected representatives do and make sure that they don't pass any laws that contradict Islam. Okay, so this new government, the Islamic Republic of Iran, that was set up following the 1979 revolution, that is the government that rules Iran today. All right, so I'm going to stop there. That was a really quick overview, a quick primer of Iranian history from sort of the beginning up until the end, at least an arbitrary beginning with the Achaemenids. But the purpose of the video was simply to give a quick overview so that you can get up to speed. If you're reading about some aspect of Iranian history, this will hopefully give you some broader context. If you're interested in learning more about Iran and you don't know anything about it, hopefully this can serve as a good first step. And then you can go on and do more reading, more in-depth reading, and get more nuance elsewhere. All right, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you again later.